The First French Republic found itself beset on all sides from the moment of its birth, thrust into immediate struggle for its very survival. France, during the first two wars of the coalitions, was in a very difficult position. These wars were a battle for the survival of the revolution, with France facing enemies both within and without. If either war were lost, it would have meant the end of the revolution and its ideals, not to mention the return of the Bourbons. Despite this, France faced almost as many internal battles as it did external ones. The First Republic did manage to survive both coalitions and their internal conflicts, however, emerging from the period even stronger than before. So, how did they do it? First off, the two wars of the coalition should be separated from each other, as the challenges they posed to France were different both in terms of internal and external pressures. In the War of the First Coalition, revolutionary France was forced to fight all the great powers of Europe by itself, while at the same time facing severe internal rebellions and instability. The war lasted over 5 years, from 1792 to 1797. It included the greatest period of internal instability, with the terror sweeping through France and constant internal struggles for power, changing the revolutionary governments from one to the next. Cities rebelled against the revolution, the most well-known being the critical port city of Toulon. Elsewhere, the war in the Vendée lasted for much of the First Coalition, as tens of thousands revolted against the Republic in support of the monarchy. In retaliation, the revolution massacred rebels and civilians alike. Over the course of 3 years, the revolt would occupy significant French forces and led to the deaths of several 100,000 people, most of them civilians. Externally, various military campaigns raged in the lowlands, Italy, along the Rhine, and France itself. At several points during the conflict, it appeared as if the revolution would be lost, only for the coalition's armies to be forced to withdraw from France. French victory at home and abroad ensured the future of the First Republic. It also led to significant territorial expansion to France's so-called natural borders. France secured the entirety of the Austrian Netherlands, the left bank of the Rhine, and other various territories. In Italy, a large number of sister republics were established as essentially puppet states, creating a buffer between France and her enemies. The War of the First Coalition saw the stabilization of France and forced future fighting beyond the Republic's original boundaries, shielding France and its population from many of the horrors of war. In the War of the Second Coalition, France again faced the majority of Europe in battle, but now with at least some established allies. It would last nearly 4 years, from 1798 to 1802. Battles raged in Egypt, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. Importantly, however, the Republic had stabilized itself internally and waged most of the war outside of France. No longer was France racked by internal rebellion and terror. Even so, defeat in the War of the Second Coalition would have meant the end of the Republic and restoration of the monarchy. Most of Europe, with the notable exception of Austria, still wished for total victory and the restoration of the old French Bourbons. The fact that France not only won the wars of the first two coalitions, but won them decisively enough to strengthen France's position in Europe beyond what was even before the Revolution is remarkable. After the dual victories, France became the most powerful country on the continent. So how did they do it? Looking at a map of Europe, one would be forgiven for believing that the coalitions France faced had the power to bring overwhelming force down upon the Republic. Numbers on paper would seem to support that conclusion, but the full might of the coalitions were never fully brought to bear against France. In a time when Napoleon had not yet cut a bloody path across Europe, the various powers were not yet truly united against France. They were as concerned about competing with each other and making sure none gained too much advantage on the European stage, as they were with fighting France. No one wanted to be the one to have bled the most in fighting France and gained the least. During this period, Russia, Prussia, and Austria were partitioning the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The British, meanwhile, were busy fighting in India against the Kingdom of Mysore. Repeatedly, the coalition members failed to coordinate and underestimated the effort required to defeat France. Underestimating the French military can be understood to some extent, at least initially. The revolution had stripped France of its many officers, and chaos of the early revolution greatly weakened the army as a whole. Future failures could be blamed, at least in part, on geography. It would be very hard for Prussia or Russia to directly support Spain. At some point, however, there is no excuse for the failure of concentrating the men and resources needed to achieve victory. Both the members of the First and Second Coalitions did not have the will to defeat France. The British, for their part, were determined to defeat France, but simply did not have an army capable of doing so, forcing them to rely on the rest of the coalition for victories on land. By the Second Coalition, Austria had given up for the most part in fully restoring the Bourbons, and instead aimed to ensure the strengthening of themselves by a limited peace. Russia withdrew early from the coalition after several battlefield defeats and annoyance at Britain's insistence of searching all ships in the Baltic. Compared to the French, the coalition's willpower was severely lacking. Not all of the credit for France's survival should be attributed to the mistakes of her enemies, of course. The revolution greatly weakened France, it is true, but also allowed for the mobilization of the nation unlike any seen before in Europe. In 1793, the Republic introduced the levy en masse, conscription on a scale that would see hundreds of thousands of men brought into the army to fight the coalitions. Conscription on such a scale would have likely led to mass revolt under the monarchy, and even for the Republic it was unpopular for many, contributing to rebellions in the Vendée. It was, overall, however, wildly successful, and gave France the soldiers it needed to fight on multiple fronts. Its success also demonstrates the widespread support the revolution received from the general population of France. While there were always those who opposed the revolution, especially its more radical aspects, the popular support that it was able to rely on created the backbone of the various revolutionary governments. The army especially benefited from this, as despite the many issues it faced, the revolutionary spirit of its soldiers carried it far. Speaking of the army, the revolution simultaneously dealt it a heavy blow with the removal of the majority of its noble officers, and afforded it an opportunity to massively improve with the promotion of new officers. Before the revolution, the old system ensured only those with noble rank could advance past a certain point. But with the arrival of the revolution, anyone with talent had the opportunity to rise through the ranks. It took time for capable officers to emerge, which contributed to many of France's early defeats, but once they did come to the fore, they helped lead France to many of its greatest victories. Great officers and motivated troops went a long way to make up for the lack of training much of the army faced. Lack of weapons, uniforms, and supply that plagued France in the early days could be made up for through determination and capturing resources from the enemy. More than one conscript was equipped with a musket captured after a battle. Conscripting so many men into the army not only allowed France to face the combined might of the coalitions, but forced their enemies to increase the size of their own armies. The Austrian Empire was one of the Republic's biggest opponents, and during the Revolutionary Wars, to compete with the sheer numbers of men France could put on the field, the Austrians had to commit serious resources to expanding their own forces and replenishing losses. Over the course of the two wars, Austria spent massive sums and racked up a significant amount of debt due to the fighting. This economic aspect was not unique just to Austria. Warfare is expensive, and all members of the coalition had to decide whether it was worth it to keep fighting France year after year, or to give up on the fighting. Information was slow to travel at the turn of the 19th century, and events in France moved quickly. The revolution itself changed rapidly as governments rose and fell from power, and different parties gained prevalence. For the revolution's enemies, accurately judging the strength of France as a whole was something they importantly failed to do. During the War of the First Coalition, the Republic lost large numbers of its early battles, but by the end they were managing to achieve decisive victories. As the War of the Second Coalition began, many of the Republic's weaknesses caused by the Revolution had either been solved or alleviated. New officers introduced new ideas about how best to wage war, two of the most noticeable being the increased prevalence of artillery in battle and a focus on more dispersed but faster troop movements. Changes such as this put the coalition on the back foot, too slow to adapt from their more traditional ways of waging war. Some nations fared better against the new Republic army than others, but as a whole they struggled to adapt. Changes on the political front, too, posed difficulties for the coalitions to adapt to. An important aspect of the First Coalition, and to a much lesser extent the Second Coalition, was the withdrawal of nations from the conflict before the end of the actual wars. The War of the First Coalition did not end until late 1797. Most of the coalition left long before that, however, as Prussia left in 1795. The Dutch Republic and Spain also left that year. The Kingdom of Sardinia and Naples left in 1796, and finally Austria left in 1797, effectively ending the First Coalition, as only Britain remained as a major power fighting against France. Spain would go so far as to even join the French side of the conflict. During the War of the Second Coalition, most of the members would drop out in 1801, even though the war itself would not fully end until 1802. Russia, Naples, Portugal, the Ottoman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire under Austria all left the coalition during 1801. Again, Britain was left alone to fight France. When a nation left the coalition, it forced the rest to consider their own commitments to the fighting. Gradual or sudden, the departure of nations from each coalition led to the will of the rest to weaken. Both coalitions ultimately collapsed due to a lack of will or ability to continue fighting France. It would be unfair to fully blame the members that dropped out of the coalitions for the coalition's failures. For the most part, those that dropped out had fought France, and had either reached a point where they could no longer seriously continue fighting, or did not see any benefit if they continued to do so. France turned out to be no easy opponent to defeat, and so many nations naturally prioritized their own interests at the time. Speaking of looking out for one's own interests, it's probably time to talk about him. Napoleon Bonaparte, it's fair to say, had an outsized influence on the course of both the First and Second Wars of the Coalitions. His actions in Italy during the First War of the Coalition decisively defeated Austria, along with their Italian allies, not only helping to lead to the end of the First Coalition War, but creating buffer states in the form of the sister republics between France and its enemies. Meanwhile, the War of the Second Coalition saw him take an even more important role, initially as a general leading French forces in an invasion of the Ottoman Empire, but later as a leader of France after seizing power. Napoleon would lead the French personally in a second Italian campaign, once more driving the Austrians from Italy. The eventual longer-lasting peace that followed the end of the Second Coalition came about in large part due to France and particularly Napoleon's ability to defeat all other powers on the continent, compelling Britain to make peace. Perhaps without Napoleon, the Republic, or whatever it would have become, may have still achieved victory in both coalition wars, but it's hard to imagine they could have done better. A victory would have been more costly, less decisive, and less beneficial to France if it were to be secured at all. Napoleon in his early days achieved some truly impressive victories, while outnumbered and outgunned, inflicting far greater losses than his forces received. The scale of his victories bought the time and resources necessary for Napoleon to build up France's army into eventually becoming the Grande Armée of the imperial period. There were many great generals during the Republic, but none came close to Napoleon. It was during this period that Napoleon would also fight alongside many of the individuals that would become instrumental to his empire: Berthier, Murat, and Massena, just to name a few. In many ways, Napoleon's rise to power undid the more progressive changes of the Republic, but he kept much of the core strengths that allowed for the Republic's survival, as long as it had, against much of Europe: mass conscription, rank based on merit, not nobility, and equality before the law were all aspects that he kept after his rise to power that strengthened France.